It sure is nice to come home at the end of a long day and enjoy a podcast. But you know what makes the experience that much better? Relaxing with a few puffs of smoke from my McQueen pipe. At McQueenPipes.com, I was able to find the perfect smoking pipe to suit my nerdy, yet dignified sensibilities. I especially love that each pipe is designed and handcrafted by a true artisan, and that all of their pipes are inspired by fantasy books and movies like The Lord of the Rings. Being a bit of a hobbit myself, my pipe is called the Barrel Rider, but they've also got pipes for wizards, rangers, dragon riders, or even goblins. If pipe tobacco isn't your thing, no worries. McQueen Pipes has got you covered with attachments for vaping or even cannabis. Head on over to McQueenPipes.com and use the code BIOGRAPHERS at checkout to receive 15% off of your entire order. Go ahead. Treat your nerdy heart to something you'll cherish and enjoy your podcast listening experience in style with a McQueen pipe. That's Mac like mac and cheese and Queen like the band. McQueenPipes.com and use the code BIOGRAPHERS at checkout for a 15% discount on your whole order. Cheers, everyone, and happy podcasting.
I do hope you can see me today from where you are.
Ich bin ein Feeling.
If I'm generally anything, I guess I'm generally miserable. This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women.
The people, I would say, there is no patent. This is... Would you patent the sun?
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
Welcome to the Biographers.
Slightly more leeway to New Year's than 4th of July, because New Year's is one of those that it's like, it's the new year, everybody's out late doing stuff, having a good old time. In your case,
I've never given a single fuck about New Year's, ever once.
Really either? Yeah, I don't really care about it, but I get it. You know what I mean? It's the night to party.
Even as a teenager, I never really had that angst of being like, oh, I don't have somebody to kiss on New Year's. I never had that, I don't know. That wasn't a thing. Valentine's would bug me, but New Year's, I was just like, I want to go to sleep.
I mean, I don't know. New Year's, I definitely had a little bit of that teeny angst of being like, oh, I'm so lonely. I wish I had somebody to kiss.
Also, as a Latino, New Year's is not fun because it's just the day where your mom is extremely superstitious about everything. You know what we got to do, right? You've got
you had the grapes or something, right?
You got to sweep something. I can't remember what that one is. You have to eat 12 grapes, which doesn't sound like a lot, but eating them consecutively, very quickly, is not fun. And then you mark based off of sweetness which month is going to be better and which month is going to be worse. And then at midnight, your mom will knock on your door because you're asleep, obviously, because you want to go to bed, and you'll have to grab empty luggage and then walk outside of your house and then go back inside to your house, because then that will mean that you get to travel this year.
Cool.
So it's just a bunch of witchy chores that I grew up with during New Year's. Mom, if you're listening to this, I love you. Sorry.
No, I luckily my mom never had anything beyond, because she's from New Orleans. She would do the black eyed peas for good luck over New Year's. That's a thing.
What's that? You eat a bunch of black eyed peas?
It's basically you stew black eyed peas because they take a while to cook, and you stew it with bits of ham and stuff like that, and you serve it over rice, and it's just a tasty dish or whatever. And I can't tell you it's actually really tasty, and I don't know the origins of it, but for whatever reason they say that it brings you good luck for the new year. So it's a thing. I had one of my coworkers recently say that it's an Irish thing, and I'm 99% sure that is completely made up. I'm almost positive it is a Southern New Orleans thing. And if it's coming from New Orleans, I would be fairly confident to say that it probably came from slavery, because they always gave the great traditions that now exist inside of New Orleans and the whole area. So just saying. I don't think it was
it's probably
white people saying
or
that.
If you're lucky, French, but probably not.
It could be, but I just have a feeling it's like gumbo.
It's one of those things where you don't want to dive into why you do it. You're just my mom did this.
Honestly,
no one else.
and look, I hope that if I Google it after this, there's some lovely story behind it. But
we got to throw it into office hours what
yeah,
the whole Black Eyed Peas thing is.
I can do that. I can put that as an agenda item when we move through this. All right. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to The Biographers. I'm Daniel Newman. With me is Akiva Miola.
Hello.
And we're about to get going on to Alexandre Dumas, part 2. And I didn't tell you this. I didn't text you because I thought it was just so stupid. I'm getting better, though. Okay? Stupid YouTube comments from people. All right? I'm getting better about them because I used to respond. And now I'm just going to delete you because I don't care. This person wrote a comment on the first episode of Alexandre Dumas, and it said, you know that Alexander Dumbass wasn't a count, right?
I'm going to say, I know who wrote that.
Do you really?
I know who wrote that. Yep. There's Osh, if you're listening to this, never listen to any of my podcasts again. I will never invite you to go and do any of this. This is my good buddy Osh.
Was it
we were
actually?
Just talking about. Yes, it was the same person that I was complaining about earlier. He decided to tell me that I should write all my prompts through, or all of my episodes through ChatGPT, because he does like computer software, and he knows that I will go on tirades about how I hate AI in general. I am such an old man about it. I hate it in every capacity, and I think it's just solving a problem that didn't exist when Google was still like a usable thing before like SEO and all of that. Whatever, we won't get into that, but that's why he sent it, because I told him, I was like, see, I try to research with ChatGPT and it gives me the wrong information, because ChatGPT told me that Alexandre Thomas Dumas, the dad, was not a count. That's not true. Like, he was a count just momentarily before he renounced the title from his father.
Well, Osh, if your intention was to piss me off, it worked.
Yeah, it worked for me too. So.
I just didn't respond. I was like, this idiot. Because what I wanted to respond with was like, if you actually listened to the episode, you would see that he was. But
I doubt he listened to the episode.
That's okay, and I forgive
that lovable
you.
Piece of garbage.
But I was very like, okay, who is this troll?
Yeah. That's my buddy.
So
kind of.
Okay, yay, Osh. I hope to meet you soon one day, because apparently we'd get along really, really well. Which, now that you say that, is like, why do you say we'd get along so well? What's wrong with me?
He's just sarcastic, and I feel like you would vibe with him.
I'm sure I would. I'm sure he was just having a good time and being a silly guy. So anyways, yeah, I just thought that was funny. And so now it's even funnier to know that it was not even a basement troll. It was somebody who specifically knew you and was trying to annoy you.
Specifically trying to piss me off.
Yeah. Well, hey, mission accomplished. Well done.
But if you want to leave any real comments, listeners, we now have comments on Spotify, which is just a new added feature in the last couple of months.
Yeah.
We are on YouTube and Apple Podcasts and a bunch of other places where you listen to your podcast. So feel free to leave a comment. And it can be something wrong, as long as we get that interaction. What is it they call it now?
Engagement.
Engagement, exactly. As long as we get that engagement, that's all that matters to me. Feel free to comment any pseudoscience bullcrap you've heard online, and I will gladly read it.
Yeah, we've said this from the beginning. Questions, comments, corrections. You can shoot us an email at thebiographerspodcast@gmail.com. And when we say corrections, we mean it. We get it. We try to read and research as much as we can, but we are not authorities on any one of the subjects that we research here. Yeah. So do let us know. And then additionally, if y'all are enjoying the show and you want to give us some support, you can do so by going to our Patreon page. That's just going to be patreon.com/thebiographers. Pretty straightforward there. Any support would be lovely and appreciated. And also, I guess we should probably give a quick little shout out to my friend Paul Klatfelter. He bought one of your knives.
Yes, thank you so much, Paul, for not only your support with the biographers, but also your support with my business, Metalwork by Miola. For those of you who don't know, my van broke down. You can learn a little bit about that in the last episode. So we're trying to raise some money so I can get myself a new ride. And I've got a bit of a discount on the website. Use code VAN at checkout for 25% off, which is really a huge discount. He bought this lovely K-tip Damascus chef knife that is being sent out to him right now. So
there you go, Paul. If you hear this and you get that knife, hope you like it, man. I've, as you probably know from listening to our show, that's how Akiva and I became friends initially. Is I took a knife making course at a forge up north from me, and he walked in and showed me a bunch of his knives that were gorgeous, and I went, hey, can you just teach me how to do that? And then I basically
That's basically the starting of my teaching career.
Yeah, and I started going like it was once a week for at least. I mean, it was probably close to a year. I was going
I think
once,
we were at like
once a week.
9 to 10 months by the time you and Jamie decided to wrap up.
Yeah. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed that knife, Paul. And with that, are you ready to get going on part 2? I'm excited to kind of see where all this goes, man.
Mm-hmm. So, in the last episode, we covered the early life of Alexandre Dumas, the father of the author with the same name. We discussed the shady origins of his father, Antoine Paiterie, who spent his days mooching off of his plantation-owning brother, Charles, until an altercation had him retreating into the forests of Saint-Domingue, where he would live as a fugitive under a fake name in the port city of Jérémie. Antoine would own a small coffee farm and have 4 children with his enslaved wife, Marie Cessette, including Alexander, who would be raised as his own while the others remained slaves. Alex would grow up in the mixed-race capital of the world for the first 15 years of his life, watching Jérémie transform from a backwater town to the center of black commerce. Everything would change, however, when Antoine, his father, got word that his younger brother, who was selected to take on the family name, died of gout. Hoping to cash in on the opportunity, Antoine sold his wife and his 3 kids and pawned Alex as a slave for a shipmaster so he could buy a ticket back to France. Antoine assumed the title of Marquis and bought Alex back, leaving the rest behind. And when Alex landed on the shores of royal France, he was now officially a count of the Paiterie family, so he was expected to perform like one. He was enrolled in the fencing academy of La Boissière, where he got to meet his mentor and icon, the Black Knight Chevalier de Saint-Georges, one of my favorite characters so far. After his training was done, he moved to downtown Paris, where he briefly lived the life of an enlightened gentleman, but after a scrap with a former slave driver that led Alex hurling the man out of a theater box, the tensions between him and his father grew until Alex couldn't take it any longer. He abandoned the family name only 14 days before his father's death, which fortunately saved him from metric tons of debt that Antoine had accrued. Now, with no family name to speak of and no money coming in, Alexander channeled his energy into a new career. He was enlisted as a lowly private in the Queen's Dragoons. In the late 1700s, muskets and cannons dominated the battlefield, with soldiers carrying guns with comically large barrels onto the field. But for cavalrymen, like the Dragoons, however, they were too unwieldy, so shorter carbines were used instead. So the black powder that were used for these shorter versions of the muskets, because the long ones didn't really fit while they were riding, would spit fire out of the barrel, right? Because black powder has a much bigger ignition size, right?
Okay.
So that's how they got the name dragons. And henceforth, the people who wielded the dragons were called the Dragoons. I'm not sure if that's like a diminutive or whatnot, but that's basically how they got their name. In fact, lots of different countries had their own Dragoons. That was like a type of soldier in the same way as infantry or marine, whatnot, because that was super common for cavalrymen to have these shorter fire-spouting muskets.
And that is one of the common denominators of a Dragoon, though, is that they are mounted on horses always, right? Isn't that it?
Yeah, well, we'll talk about it a little bit. It's interesting because there are specific cavalry units that will be called cavalry. There are the musketeers, which also had horses. The Dragoons kind of played a slightly different role. Think more like a Marine or an Army Ranger, right?
Interesting, okay.
You know, the first one in, last one out type of person.
Now, I've been confused about this for a long time, and I'm assuming you're going to get into this as well, but you just kind of said it, where I've always kind of thought it was curious that in a movie or book series, whatever, like the Three Musketeers, ain't no muskets around those guys. They're sword fighting. So I'm curious on if we're going to get to the bottom of that eventually.
That's cultural. That has to do with the culture of France. When they are at war, they are 100% using muskets. That's why they're called the Musketeers. But if you notice, D'Artagnan and his buddies generally aren't out on the battlefield. They're fighting the Cardinal Richelieu, or they're fighting each other, or they're fighting in a bar, and swords were heavily used by musketeers and dragoons. Basically, the dragoons were the musketeers. Like in a lot of ways, they were very similar, just slightly different status levels, and we'll get into that.
Okay. And I would imagine it's somewhere, a similar comparison would be like, it is the SEALs versus the Green Berets. They're basically elite forces of a specific sect of military somewhere, and they're just having different designations for specific purposes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So, that's exactly what I had here, which is, first off, there was very little difference between the Dragoons and the Musketeers besides who filled the position and where they served. While the Musketeers served within range of the capital or other royal locations, the Dragoons were sent out further into enemy territories, which meant they needed to be capable of handling the worst conditions. Training was harsh and rigorous. While Alex had gotten a gentleman's training in horse riding and fighting, he was now entering a world of life and death. Sparring and drills were done daily, and failure to comply would lead to floggings, which was common practice at the time by most commanding officers. See, unfortunately for the Dragoons, their biggest virtue was their expendability. While both musketeers and dragoons generally came from noble families, the dragoons were filled with the lowest of that social class, so generals didn't really seem to care what happened to them. While they were still mounted fighters, they tended to get common workhorses instead of the thoroughbreds that the royal guards were outfitted with, which meant that their mounts often got better treated than the soldiers in order to get them into fighting shape. So basically, musketeers, but you're put into a shittier position because you're expendable and you're given generally worse equipment and you're expected to maintain them. So like the horses were not like top tier. You're not getting like, Arabians or anything crazy. You're getting common workhorses that a lot of the training had to do with exercising the horses, grooming them properly, making sure that they're properly fed so that you can get them into fighting condition, because you're not getting like the best of the breed.
Interesting.
Right?
Okay.
Now, most of the nobles buckled under the pressure of boot camp, but Alex had felt what rock bottom was, so he executed his tasks with relative ease. The carbine dragons of the Ancien regime were finicky on the best of days, and loading and firing one while on an unruly horse made it nearly impossible. But Alex had this way of imposing his will on any steed he used, and he was able to fire on horseback perfectly, although what he truly excelled at was sword fighting. In some ways, the soldiers' biggest limitation was their lack of support from the crown. Most of the time, the dragoons didn't sleep in dedicated barracks. Instead, they had to house themselves in the cities that they were posted in. Their pay was small and always seemed to come in late, which made things especially hard since they actually had to pay for their own uniforms and equipment, which is kind of wild, right? But I guess that I've talked to some friends who are in the military, and they say, like, you get your standard issue stuff, and you can go with that, but it's generally garbage, and they tend to use their own salaries to upgrade things.
Yeah, like I remember asking this question of like everybody's high school, there's always like military people that try to come and recruit high schoolers out of high school to go into the military. And I remember the Marines came at one point and they were in their duds, you know what I mean? Like the nice coats and all that kind of stuff. And I remember asking about that and they were like, oh yeah, no, we have to buy all of this. And I remember just being sort of pissed of being like, wait. You have to pay for your own uniform? Like, you're required to wear these things and you have to pay for them? And they were like, yeah, I mean, we can write them off of our taxes, which they can because they're work expenses, but they were like, but we do still technically out of pocket have to pay for them.
That's so weird.
Which is wild.
Like, you have the warehouse that makes specifically that uniform, and you have the money which you're paying your soldiers to pay for the uniform. Why not just cut out the middleman? I don't get it. But
yeah, it would be like to me if you received the Medal of Honor and they were like, but it is a $5,000 medal that we're going to have to get you to pay for out of pocket because it is
Don't
expensive.
They do that with the Olympics?
Do they?
I've heard that you actually have to pay for your own medals with the Olympics.
I don't know
like,
that.
They'll gift it to you,
that.
But to actually permanently own it on your person, you have to buy it.
I have not heard that. That's insane. If that's big,
my
if
mom
true.
worked before she was a teacher. She worked as a maid for the Olympic Center, and she told me all sorts of crazy stories about that. Maybe we'll get into that in office hours.
I'll make a note now. I want to look.
Yeah. Now, from what I gather, most regiments were left to their own devices, which, if you know anything about military history, that kind of spells disaster. Besides the soldiers doing food raids and public drunkenness, unlike the public, the French infantry was fully allowed to duel one another. In fact, it was even encouraged as a way to sharpen one's skills. As a dragoon, the slightest offense could be used as a reason to fight, which is probably why there are no records of anyone taking issue with Alexander's race when he's first conscripted. Alex was well known as a master swordsman within the first year in the regiment, and tales began to circulate of his strength. Seeing that he was a foot taller than his comrades and built like a brick shithouse, wild stories went around their camps. For instance, soldiers claimed to see Alexander ride below a low ceiling beam, grab onto it with his arms, and then lift his horse off the ground by squeezing his legs together and doing a pull-up. Which obviously, like, that's probably not
There's
true.
no
but
way.
like, if people are like, "Yo, I saw Alex. He was riding there, and he literally lifted his horse off the ground, by grabbing a ceiling beam and pulling it up between his legs."
I mean, that's
Yeah.
Impossible, but it's a sweet story to have about yourself.
Now, this is one that I think might be true. So in another, there was a guy testing people's strength he would put his finger in the barrel of an unloaded musket and then put his hand flat on a table and then try to, with just his grip strength, close the hand so that the barrel sticks up vertically, right? You kind of picture what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then Alex was like, okay, well, that's pretty good. Why don't you bring 4? And so he puts, and each one of these is 10 pounds. He puts one on each finger and then puts his hand flat on the table and manages to bend it. This 40 pounds of musket, which is like, obviously like, 2-3 feet away because they're carbines, right? Bends them up so that he can hold them vertically. That one I think might actually be true. That sounds like a thing a human person could feasibly do if they were exceptionally strong.
No,
you're like sitting at 45 pounds, but the problem is the leverage because they're so long.
Yes.
I don't know.
That is true. I mean, I would say it is definitely possible because there are grip strength testers, and I don't know how, but my TikTok feed has decided that I want to see people's grip strength.
Same. I think they're like, you're a guy, you'd appreciate this.
Yeah, and this person will go to like roofers and all this kind of stuff. And a number of them were like over 100 pounds of grip strength.
Yeah.
In just in their squeeze ability, basically. And so I'm like, I don't know. I feel like if you were that strong, it is possible that you'd be able to lift that with your fingers, My only concern is I'm like, but your fingers aren't that muscly, and I wonder if they would just like strain and snap under that. I don't know, but it's possible.
I don't know. But a lot of the journals of people who, trained with him were like, this guy, they would even write, be like, he would put like a professional bodybuilder, because that was like a circus act at the time that you'd see it all the time, bodybuilders. He was like, this guy literally is built like a bodybuilder.
It's crazy.
He is so incredibly muscular that, and the author kind of mentions this, these stories, these tall tales about the strongest in your regiment, they might be over exaggerated, but it's not an exaggeration to say that Alex was the strongest in his regiment. It might be an exaggeration that he could lift a horse off the ground using nothing but his abs, but like, he was still the strongest, and people wanted you to know that by telling ridiculous stories, right?
That is cool.
Now, one story that does happen to be real, however, would make it into the Three Musketeers as a sign of D'Artagnan's bravado. Individual duels were common, certainly, but nothing got the men more excited than fighting an entire regiment. Like the rivalries between American Marines and the Army in World War II, the Queen's Dragoons had their own rival, the King's Regiment. Alexandre Dumas, the author, writes about a time when the two happened to be stationed in the same town. Quote, "This offered the perfect opportunity for staging a small war. Such worthy opponents were not about to let such a chance escape. One day, a soldier of the King's Regiment passes by a dragoon. The former stopped the latter and said, 'Comrade, you know something?' 'No, but if you tell me, I shall know it.' 'All right. The king fucks the queen.' 'That's a lie. It's the other way around. The queen fucks the king.' One insult was as grave as the other, and 100 duels took place in 24 hours, with my father fighting 3 of them."
Wow. That's pretty cool.
Which is like such like, you think like 1800s, they'd be so gentlemanly about it. But like one regiment going to the other be like, you know what? The king, yeah, he fucks the queen. And the other one's like, that's a lie. It's the other way around. It's the queen who does it. And then that is enough to like fight, which I think is hilarious.
I think it's also very funny. I mean, it's funny on a couple levels. One, it's funny to think about people saying fuck back then.
Yeah.
Even though I know they did, like, I think it was always part of my, like, I think that happened, but it's funny to like see it actually. But the other thing that I think is very funny is that in a time where masculinity was so like, it's funny to think about a dude back then who was like, no, the queen fucks the king. It's like, when I feel like the manly.
Well, what are you going to say? What else are you going to say? Like, you got no other.
I mean, I don't know what, if somebody said this, like, oh, hey, the king fucks the queen, I'd be like, fucking yeah, he does. Move on. Like, I don't know. How is that a problem?
I don't know. Like, but it's an offense. Remember, it's the first offense taken. It's this weird gentlemanly rule of like the dandy era, right?
Yeah.
Dandy was like not just like an offensive way that we refer to dandy now, but it was like almost like chivalric, where it's like these common traits that were associated with a gentleman, right? Which is like, you know, you need to be well learned in philosophy. You need to be good at horse riding. You need to be good at this and that and the other. Another big, you know, point of contention is you need to be good at fencing, and you never let somebody disrespect you without physical violence being a response.
Yeah.
Right. So, you know, obviously they could have said anything. They could have said your shoes are untied and you look like an idiot, and that would have been enough for these two to fight. They were just looking for an excuse, right?
Dare you, sir? How dare you?
Yeah, but I also love the fact that we get this little tidbit of like how common soldiers really talked at the time, because, you know, Alexandre Dumas is very flowery. He was literally paid by the word. So he put a lot of words in his books, and just having like just these simple, like very layman speech of like, oh, the queen fucks the king, not the other way around. Like that sounds like something that two drunk dudes at 2 a.m. would say now and get into a fist fight.
In the UK, maybe.
Yeah. Now, dueling till wounded or dead was the sport at the time, and Dumas would find himself fighting 3 consecutive duels in one day, just like in the Three Musketeers. Well, actually, D'Artagnan never really fights them if you read the books. This legendary day wasn't without its battle scars, though. In the first duel, Alexander would receive a brutal cut to the face, but despite blood dripping into his open eye, he was still able to dispatch the other 2 contestants. Now, this wound would leave him with a constant headache for the rest of his life and also vision problems, however. But while Alex was living the testosterone-infused life of a private in the Dragoons, the very crown he swore to fight began to lose its shine. 2 years into Alex's enlistment, France was beginning to fall apart. It seems that the Crown's avid hate for the English and their support for the Americans in the Revolution had, ironically, bankrupted the monarchy, causing more anti-royal sentiment in the people. Even Lafayette, the hero of the American Revolution, wrote to his good friends in the States saying that he felt the fatherland was too content and too nonviolent to overthrow the French monarch. But then, as a cruel twist of fate, Mother Nature stirred things into action. The 1780s saw some of the strangest freak weather France had ever seen. The Seine froze over. Droughts were followed by monsoons that washed fields away, and hailstorms with ice the size of baseballs would bludgeon livestock to death in their fields. The resulting famine exposed every weakness in the Crown's operations. Now, the common folks blamed the unashamed, lavish life of the king and their Austrian queen, Marie Antoinette, but in truth, most of their money was spent on the American War. The royal finance minister had made the unfortunate discovery that the royal treasury was empty, which is kind of an interesting concept because in our heads we're like, oh, the treasury is empty. They had like a physical treasury. So like he went in, he was like, oh, there's nothing in here. like imagining like there's a room called like government money and you open it and there's like one lone cricket. It's like, I don't know. That kind of cracks me up for some reason.
It's like that one guy from Game of Thrones. You remember that? Where they go to, it was like, oh God, I can't remember the name of the city, but he's that big hulking black guy, and he's the richest man in the whole. Maybe
yes, and the safe is empty.
I think it's Karth, yeah. And then that's what you learn is his true value. Is that it's not that you have the money, you got the biggest safe, which gives you the illusion of the most amount of money.
So then people are willing to loan you money, and then that makes you rich.
Exactly.
Right. And I mean, we have this today with lots of other billionaires in the world. Like Elon Musk is fairly non-solvent these days since Tesla has gone down, but people are still willing to shell out billions of dollars in order to keep him afloat because they assume that he is more solvent than he really is.
Yeah. I don't want to put any more brain power into that man.
Okay, no Elon box office today.
Yeah.
Or soapbox
Yeah.
box office. Now, for most peasants, bread became so expensive that it took up nearly half of their monthly salary alone. So when the finance minister suggested raising the taxes, effigies of him were burnt on the street. The situation was boiling over, and the king needed to act fast. In Versailles, stories were told of a near mythical assembly that the kings of old once held to protect the realm. After nearly 2 decades, Louis XVI called an assembly of the Estates General. Now, the Estates General was sort of a grand hearing where the 3 estates, the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners, would come together, vote on issues, and decide what to do next. The 3rd estate, the commoners, were originally pretty excited, and peasants from all across the land would come to the city halls to file complaints. But when the 1st Estates General was held, the people went from hopeful to pissed off. See, the Estates General assumed that all 3 groups, church, crown, and common folks, would have an equal say, which was absolutely ridiculous, considering the fact that the 3rd estate consisted of 96% of the population, while the church and nobility combined only accounted for 4. And what's worse is the 1st and 2nd estate would almost always vote together, seeing that most clergy were nobility themselves. If you remember, Richelieu from, like 50 years ago was also a duke as well as a cardinal.
Also,
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say also, if I'm not mistaken, what you just said, and maybe I'm stealing a little bit of your thunder here, the whole idea of the general people of France, the common folk of France cannot eat bread is where the term from Marie Antoinette, which is not true. This is not historical, but the legend of they can't afford bread, then let them eat cake.
Yes, that was slander, right? That was
right.
One of those times. Marie Antoinette was certainly like kind of a vapid, rich, white lady from Austria, but she was not necessarily cruel.
No, not the impression I've gotten either.
Yeah,
and again, that's a false quote.
That
never happened. It's a common misconception of history.
Yeah, like so many quotes are just not real. Quotes are such an easy thing to get mashed up and translated, but yeah. So the Estates General was supposed to be this like big mythical thing, and it was just it was terrible. Issue after issue, the common people would get shut down until they were so outraged that they demanded a national assembly instead, with each citizen counting for 1 individual vote. This demand for self-governance was an outrage to the king, so he sent his personal guards to block the assembly hall. But when the representatives found the doors to be locked and barred, they began having assemblies in the tennis court across the street and refused to leave until France had its own constitution, just like the Americans they fought for before. Also didn't know that tennis was that old.
I didn't either. That's interesting.
Now, outside of the tennis court, the common people were beginning to heat to a boil. Bread had become more and more rare, and the poor began to die of starvation. Raids across the city had started by stealing grain, but as the king continued to be silent with no solution available to him, the people started looting for guns as well. The first fort that they broke into was chock full of muskets, but the ammunition was held somewhere else, an old prison called the Bastille.
Mm-hmm.
Now, right or wrong, the crowd in the city became hungry for freedom and for blood. On July 14th, after negotiating a good faith surrender with the warden, the people stormed in, killing him and parading his corpse as a symbol of the death of the failed state. And despite its bloody origins, Bastille Day is celebrated as France's 4th of July, as most of you know.
The event, as I remember from high school history, was known as the storming of the Bastille, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Now, you would think under such circumstances, the Queen's Dragoons would be brought in to stop the rebellion, but the crown knew that it would do more harm than good if their soldiers were ordered to attack the mob. See, not every person working at the Bastille was killed. Many members of the Royal Guard would choose to defect, claiming themselves as some of the first soldiers in the new, quote, National Guard. The royal minister of war would soon inform the king that he could no longer guarantee the loyalty of his own army, and he was right. As mobs raged on in the city, the dragoons were stationed 100 miles away in the sleepy city of Laon. Perhaps there weren't any bread riots there, but anti-royal sentiment was strong in the region, and the men of the Royal Dragoons began to question authority. Between meals, dragoons would question the ethics of turning on their own citizens, and soldiers passed around pamphlets to one another, careful not to be caught. As one paper passed over Alexander's hands, the print read, quote, "We are citizens before soldiers, Frenchmen before slaves." The sentiment probably meant more to Alex than anyone else in his battalion. Luckily, he would no longer serve an unchecked, unjust king. Only a few days after the Bastille fell, the total power of the monarchy did as well, and the National Assembly would be the primary force in the land.
Very cool. Very, very cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. Like, this episode's going to be a little bit of like back and forth because we don't get to see Dumas in the direct heat of the action so much until like the end of this. So I'm kind of doing like a meanwhile on the farm sort of thing here.
Yeah, personally, I always love that stuff. And I think it's utterly important because understanding a person is not just understanding the events that they participated in, but all of the events that happen around them, which is why if anybody listened to our series on Pancho Villa, it was, I mean, at least for the first 2 or 3 episodes, a lot of it was just about
just context.
Exactly. Yeah. What was the world around this person that led them to do what they did and why they did it, kind of a thing. And even to the extent with Pancho Villa, though we both kind of agreed by the end of it that it was like, this is not a great guy, all said and done. It was like, you could almost see, though, that...
You could see why he got to the conclusions that he did based off of the context of his life.
And why he became a violent person. It wasn't just that it was like, oh, he just decided to kill people. Blah. It was like, well... it's like you send a kid from the suburbs to San Quentin, he's probably going to come out pretty violent. You know what I mean? It's sort of how it's going to work. And I would say it's a similar situation to... Anyway, we're getting way off topic, but context is important. That's all I'm
totally
saying.
Get it, though. Yeah. And that's basically what's happening with the Dragoons. Like, they might not be in the middle of Paris. And it's honestly a good thing because a lot of the Dragoons were also foreigners. The crown... Their recruiting efforts were pretty terrible because nobody really liked the king for the last 30, 40 years. So they had to hire people from outside of the country. That was their one issue. So they were like, okay, we might have, foreign nationals in our military. We can't necessarily trust them as much because they're mercenaries. They could be paid off. And then 2, these pamphlets were going around. The soldiers didn't agree with the people that were ordering them anymore. So... Yeah. He was sort of lucky in this situation because if he found himself in France, if he was one of the musketeers instead of one of the dragoons, we talked musketeers operated mainly in the capital, he could have been fighting against the wrong side, right? And that could have made him perfect guillotine fodder when Robespierre and all those guys tend to come in and you see a little bit more like Les Mis action.
Yeah, totally.
A month later, the battalion would receive their first orders in ages, but it wouldn't be from the Royal War Offices. Instead, Alex and his fellow dragoons, now members of the National Guard, would be called to Villers-Cotterêts by a hotel clerk who was now in charge of the city's defense. While Bastille Day was a sign of national pride for the French, their problems were far from solved. In fact, they just begin. Granaries continued to deplete, and bread went from 50% of the common income to 90%.
Jeez. With
the truly hungry being forced to eat whatever they didn't throw up. Like, this is the part where you start boiling your shoes. This is the part where I remember I watched a video about somebody living in North Korea during one of their famines, and their whole thing was like, oh yeah, my mom would tell me to go out into a field, and whatever the rabbits ate, I would eat. Jeez. Like, if I saw grass that came, that's where we're getting with Paris. And it's even worse because, as you know, Paris is a cesspool, and there's like no living things in the vicinity of Paris. So people are going nuts at this point. Right?
It was sort of like, I learned this when I went to Ireland when I was young, that during one of the famines that happened in Ireland, they would find people out in the fields dead with green stains all around their mouth because they were trying to eat grass, and grass has no nutritional value for humans. Basically, we can't extract it, at least 99% of the time. So they would try to do it just to sate the hunger that they had, but it had no nutritional value and it would stain around their mouths. So that was like a common thing in Ireland. And it's just a horrific thought to think about, of like encountering dead bodies out in the field due to starvation with their mouth covered in grass stains. It's horrible.
Yeah. And then in the city, it's like, we got I was
wharf
thinking
rats,
of history of the world, where they're like, rats for sale, rats for sale.
Yeah, literally.
Nothing. I've got absolutely nothing for sale. Like, I think that's where we're getting at this point. Also, like 50% of your income for just bread was already crazy. 90% is like, oh, so I just don't eat. Like either I don't eat or I kill somebody for food. That's where we're getting to. A lot of people are like, wow, the French Revolution, they take it as this. And this is something that I've learned as I've gone into this. They take it as this sign of like how brutal a revolution can get, but you have to remember that this was a revolution on top of a famine, right? Like the way that the mob went nuts and started killing people willy-nilly as we got to the guillotine and the Robespierre sort of era is a result of the fact that everybody was either jacked up on caffeine and like super like going nuts over Enlightenment, or like a common person who was like starving.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on there, and out in the villages of France where Alexander and the dragoons were stationed, they kind of had their own problems as well. In small towns like Villers-Cotterêts, news of brigands raiding for food led to a time called the Great Fear. Basically, these brigands thought that the famine was not real, that it was created by the monarchy in order to stop the rebellion, because they're like, how could these two things be showing up, so perfectly? It sounds like a conspiracy theory that could happen today, right? Where like a natural disaster occurs around the same time that a government is doing something that we don't like, and we were like, oh, well, COVID's a great example. Like we were like, oh, the government made COVID to bring, make us stay at home or something, right? Kind of the same thing is happening with this famine. So now they're having brigands, basically bandit gangs, roaming the countryside looking for essentially haciendas, right? Estates where they could go and raid for grain. Right. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is those estates also housed all of the people in the villages nearby. So the granaries were used for both. So you basically be stealing from villagers as well. But they didn't know that. They didn't think that. They were just thinking like the famine was, fabricated, right?
That's crazy.
And it also kind of came up with an odd problem. See, bandits didn't wear uniforms, obviously, and seeing that the common folk were now elected to defend themselves, neither did they. So sometimes search parties of a town's citizens would go out looking for bandits, only to find another search party armed with muskets, and then since neither knew which one was a gang, they would start shooting each other without asking questions. So we'd have like, one town go out, be like, we got to find the bandits, and another town next door doing the same thing. They see one another and like, those must be bandits. And then they just start fighting and killing each other. It was absolute chaos, right?
It's crazy.
In Villers-Cotterêts, the man in charge of the defense was a guy named Claude Labouré. And he kind of saw what was happening and decided to take initiative by using his new powers as a citizen to call professionals, the dragoons, for help. 20 soldiers outfitted in neat wool uniforms would arrive in the town, and Labouré was required to find a home for all of them during their service. When he saw the striking image of Private Dumas, he was compelled to give him room and board. Luckily, the following months were relatively peaceful for the little town, and any bandit raids that came by were easily dispatched by the ex-dragoons. Staying in the hotel, Alex would spend his nights charming the Labouré family with stories of his life in the Caribbean, and despite his oddly noble bearing, which they couldn't help but notice, his staunch, patriotic ideals were very close to Claude's heart. Alexander's allegiance was to the Republic, to democracy, but it wasn't just the kindly innkeeper that Alex gained favor with. Labouré's daughter, a young woman named Marie-Louise, would become enamored by the tall, dark and handsome soldier staying in her father's hotel. Unlike the flings of the past, Alexander appeared to be a total gentleman with Marie, charming her and telling her tales of the wild oceans of America. In a letter to her friend, Marie-Louise writes, quote, "My father set his heart on taking a man of color who belongs to the detachment. He's very nice. His name is Dumas, yet his companions say that's not his real name. He is said to be the son of a lord from Saint-Domingue or somewhere in those parts, and he's as tall as Previs, but has better manners. You see, my dear and good Julie, he is a fine figure of a man." So basically, like, they're like, wow, this guy's like so interesting looking. We gotta talk to him. Claude, Marie's dad, was like, well, you can stay at my hotel while you're protecting the town. And then Marie's like, oh shit, he's like kind of cute. And like now he's telling stories about the Caribbean. He's like, what is the total gentleman move here is like he became best friends with her dad first. Like the two of them would like hang out and talk about, politics and agree on everything, which is already like a good way to slide into that family, right? So Marie was like, yo, like, and Prevost was, I think, somebody that she was talking to before. She's like, oh yeah, Prevost is nice, but he's taller and he's nicer and he's cuter. Like I want to be with Alexander.
I was going to say, I feel like if we translated this into modern lingo, it would be like, so girl, there's this guy who's like been staying with us for a little while. And like, one, he's like really good with friends with my dad. And like, I'm really close with my family. So like that like really helps a lot because they're getting along super well. And then like, he's not even from here. He's actually from like the islands or whatever. So he has this kind of bit of like an accent and his last name is this, but people say that like, I've heard somewhere like on Facebook or somewhere, there was a post that like used to be, he changed his name, but that's actually kind of mysterious and cool. And let me tell you, he's fine.
That's exactly the.
Like, that's basically what she said.
Translated that. That's exactly the message. So while feelings stirred between Alex and Marie in the small town, in Paris, activity in the newly formed assembly was shaping the nation faster than ever seen before. Legislation that would normally take decades to decide on was made overnight, and patriots spent caffeine-fueled nights writing proposals for the next day. By late August, Lafayette, with the help of Thomas Jefferson, wrote the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Now, French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, Thomas Jefferson was the ambassador in France, and he actually witnessed a lot of what's going down here. There are tons of journals about his experiences while he was living in France.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I mean, they were homies. Like, Lafayette and George Washington were good friends. Jefferson, all of those dudes, right?
And also, I could have, maybe this was at a different point in history, but I could have sworn that Benjamin Franklin was the ambassador. Was that later?
Benjamin Franklin was the ambassador during the American Revolution, which happened about 20 years ago. So, like, most of the old generals in their heyday fought in the Americas.
Wait. Oh, so 20 years ago. Wait. So what period in time are we at right now?
We're in the 1780s and 90s.
So
right?
20 years prior to this is when Benjamin Franklin was the ambassador in France?
Yes. While they were, because it took a lot of time to gear up in order to, actually rebel against the English, right? 1776 is our Independence Day, right? That's the end of the war.
Yeah.
But originally, people like Benjamin Franklin were going to France to garner support from the French.
Oh,
because
okay.
like we said in the first episode, most of the war was actually fought by the French.
Yeah.
Like, more ships from the British Navy fought French people during the American Revolution than American people.
Gotcha.
Crazy, right?
I'll also say this really quickly for anybody that's listening. I hope you can't hear it, but literally a cement mixer just pulled up outside of my house.
That's lovely.
So that's great.
We've
I
had
hope you
all
can't
sorts
hear
of
it.
audio stuff going on today, man.
I know. But anyway, just want to give a forewarning. If you hear like a weird hum or something, which I hope you can't, but if you can, there's a heads up.
Yeah. Benjamin Franklin, he would be pretty old by now. He might even be dead. I don't think so.
I thought he made it past the revolution. But anyway, continue.
Yeah. In October, after the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which was basically named after our Declaration of Independence, right? October, crowds of women would march on Versailles, protesting for bread and flour and forcing the royal family to move back to Paris for the first time in a century. This was actually a really crazy, brutal protest. It was all women's protest, right? They were basically, mad that they didn't have any food and there was no way to buy food. So they marched on Versailles, which is where the royals originally stayed. And they were like, well, if we can't eat bread, we'll eat Marie Antoinette and we'll chop her up. Like they are going nuts outside, right? And Marie Antoinette has like a hidden passageway and she hears all this go down. And like they burst into like the first set of gates in Versailles, from what I understand.
Yep.
So they're about to enter the building and she goes down into this hidden passageway, runs all the way to the back of it, try to open the other door on the other end of the hidden passageway, and finds that it's locked. So for like 3 hours, she can hear these people screaming that they want to eat her outside, these starving people, right?
Jeez.
And she's banging on the door, waiting for somebody to come and open it because she's now a rat trapped in a tunnel.
Jeez.
And it takes like 2 hours before somebody finds out where she is, and she eventually makes her way out of it. But these people, I want you to get the idea of, well, maybe don't get the idea of angry mob out of your head yet. It is an angry mob, but it's an extremely justified, ravenously hungry angry mob. Like, these people aren't just here because they hate Marie Antoinette. They're here because they're starving and they think that it's her fault, right? Like, it feels logical because they've seen all of the crazy expenditures that she's done in the past.
I mean, it is one of those. Look, you know this about me, but if anybody else doesn't, my wife's family, they are originally from the UK. And it's not my argument to have, and I don't really have much skin in the game, but I do see the monarchy that exists in the UK as something that just needs to go. Because I looked it up, and it's something like, I want to say that it's about 2% of every single person in the UK's salary every year goes to supporting and making the royal family wealthy. And that's not even including the investments they get to make with that money. So they're making hand over fist by basically just being born that way.
And I'd love to know what everybody thinks in the comments about this, but I totally second that opinion. They also do have some weird level of power over people. Like, it's illegal to protest the queen and king during coronation.
Right.
Every, TV channel is playing the coronation. There is like still this level of like dogma that comes with having a monarch, where even if they're a figurehead, which is what, France is originally going to try at first. They're going to try to do sort of an England thing.
Right. And then add to it the fact that it's not just a monarchy, because technically whoever is in charge, either the king or the queen, they are the head of the Church of England by default. Yeah. Which was established, I believe, by Henry VIII, right? Because he was like, I want more wives and I can't divorce through the regular church, so I'm going to make my own church with hookers. And
yeah, that's
right?
Crazy. That he had that sort of resources, but yeah.
But so looking at this, where the mob is mad at Marie Antoinette for being starving, it technically wasn't her fault, but from their point of view, it was basically like, you are getting X amount of dollars from our taxes every single year. You get to live in the lap of luxury in a gigantic palace.
You get to simulate being a peasant in your backyard if you want to.
Meanwhile, cut to all of us starving and trying to eat rats from the sewer. You can see where that type of anger would come from.
Nobody is eating food here, and I see one house that everybody is eating just fine.
Exactly, right. And not even just fine, eating lavishly in the nicest place you can eat it, and basically doing nothing to help us. Yeah. You can see why you get a little pissed at that.
And, as a result, Marie Antoinette, King Louis, the whole royal family was no longer allowed to live in Versailles. Versailles was, Paris was small at the time. Versailles was a town slightly outside of it. It's 14 miles away from the center of Paris.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it's considered a suburb. But at the time, that was like, you're living in a different city. You don't get to do that. So the mob basically forced the royal family to live in Paris for the first time in like 150 years, because they didn't want to live there because it was dirty and nasty and gross.
Which I do have to say quickly, too, it's funny to think about, because shout out to my cousin Sean, one of my best friends. Love him. He's a great dude. He proposed to his now fiancee Lindsay at Versailles when they were on a trip in Europe. And that is cute, and that is romantic, and that is adorable, but it is funny to think about how it's like,
this was one of the worst places to be at some point in history.
This was a point where literally there was a mob of people shouting they want to dice up and eat the queen. That's pretty brutal.
I'm so hungry, I could eat They're like, how hungry are you? Yeah, so they're now living in Paris because they're like, okay, motherfuckers, if you get to be all rich and famous, you get to live in the same town as us. You can see us every day.
Yeah, totally.
And the National Assembly was also kind of having its own issues as well, which is like the new semi-democratic thing that they're doing. It was gigantic. It was swelling in size. So instead of the tennis court that they were originally hanging out in, the group moved again, this time in the large riding hall where actually Alexander first took his horsemanship lessons, his horse riding lessons.
Cool.
Kind of a cool connection there. Now, with over 1,200 members, Jefferson wrote to Thomas Paine that he was kind of worried that the size of the new governing body would lead to confusion and chaos. He wasn't wrong. The building was narrow and long, so for simplicity's sake, conservatives sat on the right of the building, while radicals and progressives sat on the left. This tradition is passed on politically ever since. This is how we get left wing and right wing. Was from this time while they were holding assembly in this horse riding place.
That's wild.
I don't know horse stuff.
Yeah,
on the left wing,
arena or something. I don't know.
Horse arena.
Yeah.
Horse smackdown. But that sounds like wrestling.
Horse smackdown. I would watch that.
Sunday. Chevalier de Saint George is going to throw a horse at another man. I don't know. But yes, this is how we get the left and right wing. So on the left wing, a group of white Enlightenment thinkers formed the, quote, Society of the Friends of the Blacks, which I'm hoping sounds less abrasive in French. That's what the name of, like, the progressive hangout was, which sounds like an entrapment scheme if you were to come up with your own group called that today. But seriously, though, they seem to be a relative force for good, and they often invited men of color to argue with them against slavery. But on the right, an opposition was formed called the Club Messiah, which claimed that the end of slavery would be the collapse of French society. Woo. Almost every position in the government needed to be filled at this time as well. Down to the clerks, these positions were voted on, and despite having zero resources for new members of the government, volunteers kept the vessel afloat. There was no food, no sleep, and also no money. The machine that was French liberty was being powered by nothing but pure enthusiasm at this point. Well. Like everything is empty. All royals have left. Like, the aristocrats are being basically hunted down, or at least not given jobs at this point. We're not quite at the guillotine stage yet. But they're like, we can't pay you, but we need a clerk. And someone's like, yeah, I can do that for 40 hours a day. What am I going to do? Go home and eat? Can't do that. So might as well be here. And that's kind of how the government managed to get its which is crazy, because could you imagine, like, if someone was like, hey, man, would you, just for the sake of us, work for the U.S. government for 40 hours a week for free? I'd be like, no, dude. No.
I will also say it's really wild to hear that was still the argument for pro-slavery in France at the time, because fast forward 70 years probably from that point in history, literally in the United States, they were saying the exact same arguments. People that were pro-slavery were like, it'll collapse our society. You have no idea how important this is to the backbone of blah, 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 blah.
Yes.
And like, nope. I mean, it was even a step further here where there was a lot of people that were religiously motivated, and they were trying to use the Bible to justify it and say that it was actually in accordance with God's law, which is even, I guess they're kind of not wrong, but I don't want to get into that according to some biblical scripture. But it is weird to think that it was nothing was learned basically from the French.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's kind of what happened with there's a ton of stuff about that with Europe. Like, I remember the Irish were one of the first people to end slavery in Europe, like full stop. And they had a huge issue with Irish plantation owners, because they're like, you grew up in a country where you knew slavery was wrong, and you moved to America to come and seek a profit. Like, you're despicable.
Ooh,
and
wow.
kind of the French had the same issue. In fact, fast forward to World War II, French soldiers actually were getting into trouble during Allied runs together, because the French were totally fine with black soldiers hanging out with them and going to bars. That wasn't a weird thing for them. So then French officers had to tell French soldiers, hey, we're going to lose allyship with the United States Army if you don't be if you aren't mean to black people when you see them.
That's nuts.
And they're like, but that's ridiculous. And I'm like, you got to do it. Otherwise, the United States military is going to get offended.
That's insane.
So then black people had to be like, sorry, man, you can't come to the bar with us, which is so weird, right?
It's bizarre. It's really
abrasion. Weird. But yeah, so you got the two clubs, the Friends of the Blacks, and then the Club Messiah. Club Messiah was like, slavery good, Friends of Blacks, slavery bad, basically. Which is weird, because actually some of the Society of the Friends of the Blacks were plantation owners, but they were just so hopped up on nationalism that they were like, I'm fine with losing my entire business as long as we come up with a constitution that's ethical.
Wow.
Like, there was a lot of that. Or like, I'm fine with slowly shutting it down or finding a way to pay the people that I'm currently enslaving, or like coming up with different solutions that today would seem terrible, but at the time were incredibly progressive. But yeah, no money in the government. Volunteer hours are basically the only way that they're keeping France afloat. And as tensions continue in the city, the village Alex is stationed in seems to be relatively safe, so it's time for him to return to Paris. In the few months Alexander spent in Villers-Cotterêts, he had fallen deeply in love with Marie-Louise, but he didn't know what to do. It was one thing to be admired man to man, but to ask Mr. Labouré to marry his daughter was another. There was still a chance that he could be rejected for his African heritage, but as time grew closer for him to leave for the capital, he summoned up the courage to ask for her hand in marriage. Dang. To Alexander's surprise, Claude Labouré accepted the proposal with open arms. It seemed the old man had no qualms with having a black son, but he did have one request. Alexander must become a sergeant before the two could be married. Alexander agreed, and Marie-Louise was delirious at the idea of marrying a man like Alex. But the moment was bittersweet, however, since only a few weeks later, she saw her new fiancé ride back to Paris with a sword at his hip and a carbine on his back.
Dang. Well, that's cool of her dad, man, in that period of time, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
To just be like, hey, yeah, right on, you're cool, you know? It's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was like, it's kind of gross and nasty, but it's like one thing in French society if you were a white dude with a black or mixed wife, but the other way around was generally not considered very good. But since both of these people were dead Republicans in like the Republic sense,
right? They
were totally cool with it. They're like, yeah, you're a citizen, I'm a citizen. There is no difference between us. Doesn't matter where you grew up or where you came from. I also think Dumas, he was a count at some point, but you get to know him for 5 seconds, you hear his life story, you're like, oh, obviously you're not one of them. Like you're not an aristocrat.
I was about to say, what do you mean one of them?
The summer of 1780 was pretty good for the revolutionaries. In the Field of Mars, where the Eiffel Tower now sits today, a celebration of the revolution would be held, and hundreds of thousands of volunteer hours worked to make it happen. At the center of it, oddly, was King Louis. See, we haven't quite gotten to the whole guillotine thing, and France instead would have a new role for their monarch. Instead of being called the King of France, Louis was now dubbed the King of the French. He didn't own the land, but he did have a responsibility to the people, mainly the new job of agreeing with all of the decisions made by the National Assembly. In short, he pretty much had the same role as the English monarchy has now, which was to smile and wave and let democracy do its thing. Right? But no amount of smiling and waving could make Louis happy to be a figurehead. As the year went on, the king got delusional, fantasizing that his in-laws, the royals of Austria, would help him retake power if he could just get out of this godforsaken city. So one night, while disguised as a valet, the king headed for the border. The king must have forgotten to pack his lunch, since he asked his coachman if he could stop at an inn for food. Unfortunately for old Louis, after a bartender matched his face to a newly minted coin, the jig was up, and he was arrested and taken back to Paris, which... bartenders are like, I know faces. That guy must have really known a face if he could look at a coin and be like, that's the king!
For real. Because it's also one of those where it's like, those coins weren't like photographic. They were just sort of like impressions of. And it's also, I gotta say though, it's one of those, it's like, all right, Louis, like, what were you doing? Were you still wearing your crazy wig? Like, come on, man, you gotta grow out a beard, like, can I get something.
He's like, can I get champagne? And the guy's like, fucking what?
Right. That's what I'm saying. It's like, what types of Bordeaux do you have? Like, wait, excuse me? No, but seriously, if you're fleeing like that, grow out a beard, put on a fake mustache, something. Like, what are you doing?
Like he could have, there were so many better ways that he could have done that. Just don't have lunch. Go.
Right. Or send your driver in for you and be like, can you just have him to like wrap it up in a handkerchief for me to like munch?
Oh, true. Yeah, he could have eaten it in the carriage.
Like, what are you doing, guy? Like, no, you have to have your soup at the table. It's the French way.
Dude, they lampooned the crap out of him for this. Like, the French version of The Onion at the time went nuts for this. Like,
that's fair.
There was all sorts of stuff being like, Louis was so fat that he couldn't wait 5 minutes before, going and to Austria. Like he couldn't.
Seriously.
I understand it was like a date. And by the way, on a carriage, I'm pretty sure from where he is, Paris, to Austria would have been maybe 24 hours. You can't not eat for 24 hours when the whole world would pretty much kill you if they saw you get out of the carriage.
Or like, I don't know, you're in France. Maybe like
Pack a lunch.
pack some cheese, right? You guys got dried meats all over the place. Get some dried meats in there and some cheese.
Get one of those buccaneers to come and get you something.
Grab a bottle of wine or two, chuck it in your carriage. You're fine, dude. But he's like, no, I need my roast beef. Like, come on. It's
And he also kind of ruined a good thing. Like, I even write here, I was like, what could have been a cozy yet meaningless reign became a prison sentence when the people realized that their king intended to betray the cause. You know, riots broke out into the streets, and Lafayette, the hero of the American Revolution, it got so heated that he actually had to declare martial law because, which, I mean, to be fair, as a French person, what did you expect?
Right.
Did you think he was just going to be cool with all of this? And the answer is yes. And the reason why is because that whole celebration of the Field of Mars, like I said, he was in all of it. He was like showing up while people were setting up. He was like doing all of the things to make it seem like he was enthusiastically interested in this new era of France. Probably because he hoped that would help his chances of escaping. I don't know. So Alex Dumas and the 6 Dragoons were called into the city to keep the peace during the riots. All around, inexperienced ex-royal guards escalated things to a boiling point, but Dumas and his men had seen real battle, and they knew how to keep things cool. At the end of the day, Alexander wanted to see the new republic shine, so he respected the protesters so long as they remained nonviolent. His time there proved successful, and after the riots, Alexander was promoted to corporal, which is one rank higher than private. This kind of reminds me of, like, I've heard a lot of talk about how ex-military tend to make really great police officers because, and it depends, obviously, depending on the condition of their service, but I've heard that they are better adapted at stressful situations where, like, if they hear a gunshot, they'll be like, oh, that was a gunshot, versus, like, immediately grabbing a firearm and being like, what was that?
Right.
You know? And it's kind of like, that was like Dumas and his men. They're like, you know, they can tell when somebody wants to kill you and when somebody just wants to fight.
Right.
Right. So they managed to keep things cool in a way that some of the other guards weren't able to. And a few months later, the arrest led to the King of Austria warning France that they would gather the necessary forces to fight the new assembly if King Louis wasn't returned to his throne. It was mainly an empty threat, but the French government didn't know that. And the people were worried that all of their progress would fall away under the Austrian sword. They were now the only country in Europe that was ruled democratically, and Austria was one of the most powerful nations on the planet at the time. Enlightenment scholars began to find ways to validate a preemptive strike on the royal forces. For the French patriots, it wasn't enough to simply defend themselves from Austria. They believed that since the Austrian soldiers were compelled to fight by a king, they were basically slaves to their own government, and it would be unethical to allow them to live under oppressive rule. The line between the defense of liberty and just all-out conquest was kind of getting hazy here. Right? They're like, well, you know, we can't just kill slaves of the king. We have to free them. So in order to free them, we can't just let them attack us. We have to go in and get rid of the king for them. Kind of like, you know, people make jokes about, like, the second that America has, like, bad trade agreements with a dictatorship, they're like, you know what? This place needs some freedom. We're going to go in and, like, this place needs democracy. The French would march on Austria with Corporal Alexandre Dumas in their ranks. Alexander would be sent to Belgium, fighting in a similar way as he did in the Dragoons, being the first man in and the last man out. His daily routine was to set up small groups of scouts to watch the perimeter of the army and make sure no Austrians were able to take the main group by surprise. As interesting as that might sound, they ran into no one at all for months, besides a few farmers who were probably tired of them trampling their crops. But on August 11th, while riding his usual beat, the young corporal noticed something out in the distance. He could barely make it out, but it was the blue and white uniforms of Austria approaching his army's position.
Ooh.
Finally getting into some battle. Alex only had 4 men with him. Remember, it's a scouting party. And the Austrians had brought a full raiding party of 13. The sensible thing to do was to call for backup. Perhaps he had no time, or he was just tired of waiting around because Alex decided to do the unthinkable. He charged head on. The Austrian forces, shocked by this show of force, ran away behind a ditch wide and deep enough that no cavalry could possibly reach them, or so they thought. As they loaded their muskets, Alexander rushed them with his trusty steed that he named Joseph, and being a top-rate rider, Alex tugged on the reins, and Joseph leaped across the massive gulch until the Austrians stood right before him, only feet away.
Jeez.
Seeing a 6-foot-tall black man leaping across a 7-foot-wide ditch with a sword in hand was enough for them to turn their white uniforms brown, and the 13 men, with their loaded muskets, laid down their weapons and surrendered.
No shit.
Yeah. So basically, they're like, this guy is going to... And what's crazy, too, is they all had loaded muskets. So, like, the psychological... It was all psychological. They were just like, oh, my God, this guy's going to kill all of us, because... What single man runs after 13 dudes and then manages to leap over? Like, think like if you're living out in the middle of nowhere and you're on those dirt roads, one of those deep ditches that are like 8 feet deep by like 6 or 7 feet wide.
Right.
Leaps all the way across it on horseback and then is 2 feet away from them. Right. Sword in hand, like, okay, go ahead. Try to pull the trigger. So then they just dropped everything and they surrendered.
Well, I think it's probably one of those things, too, where they were, I mean, I feel like at that point in time, right, it's not like you loaded a new clip into your gun. It was like, if you miss, even if you just like smack this guy in the arm, you're toast.
Yeah,
right?
Like he's going to trample you with his horse or stab you with the sword or shoot you with the carbine.
Exactly.
Like,
you're going to get taken out. So it was probably this calculated move, too, of being like, dude, it's at such short range that if he's able to push this off, basically any one of our guns, we're all dead. Which is crazy, That's super cool, though.
They basically just like shit themselves and dropped all their weapons. And, Alex knew that he had perfectly fooled them, right? He knew that he was severely, outnumbered. But the first thing that he did when they dropped the weapons is he jumped to the ground, grabbed all of them, packed them up on his horse, and then he made the guys walk to camp. And when they crossed over the hill, the Austrians noticed that they were 13 dudes and there were only 4 guys out there on patrol, and they could have easily taken them out.
Yep.
But they were like, well, it's too late. I don't have any weapons. The jig is up. Like, it's over. And in those days, prisoners were a pretty rare sight. So when Alex finally arrived back in camp, his story spread like wildfire. While dismounting his horse and tying it up, Alex was told to report to the tent of General Bournonville. When he arrived that night, he found a dinner spread waiting for him, and the general asked Alexander to tell him the story in person. He entered the tent as a corporal and walked out as a full sergeant. Yeah, we're moving up the ranks, baby. Now he can marry his girl, right?
Yeah, that was what I was like, yay!
His heroism made it all the way back to Paris, actually in the newspaper, and they confirmed the story. People, a lot of the times his son told tall tales of him, but this was a real one where he just like single-handedly made 13 dudes surrender. Kind of reminds me of that guy in the Pacific during World War II who would just like go into caves with Japanese people and be like, "You're surrounded. Come out there with your hands up," and it'd be like one guy, and he got like 30 people to surrender just by going in there and just like lying, and then everybody would like drop their weapons and walk out and they'd be like, "Ah, damn it!"
I've never heard that before. That's crazy.
Yeah, there's like I can't remember what the name of the dude was. I'm pretty sure he was like native or something. But yeah,
it's cool.
So he's all over the newspapers in Paris, and speaking of the new government in Paris, shit was going wild in the assembly hall. After hearing of a particularly bad loss in Verdun, the assembly believed that the only way that they could have lost was if there was a spy in their midst. Members like the extremely radical Robespierre believed that ex-aristocrats were double-crossing the nation, and the mob went wild. So-called street trials were performed for weeks with no real due process, and over 1,200 men and women were killed, starting with the nobles and priests, making their way down to common thieves. Law and order had left the building, and General Lafayette decided he was going to leave too, but it was too late for him. On a trip to sail to America, Lafayette was caught as well and would spend 5 years living in prison.
Wow. I'm
just thinking, nobody's got pictures. Once you get past a certain point, no one's going to recognize you, right? How are these people getting caught? They might, like, I bet you, like, back in the day, maybe because, like, they weren't on their phones so much, they just were better with faces. I don't know.
Yeah.
But he was caught and he was imprisoned.
And I also wonder if there was... So I would be willing to bet there was something that had to do with papers, right? That were like, hey, show us your papers. And I would be willing to bet they were a lot harder to forge than we would imagine, right? Where we would assume, oh, you can just write something and blah, 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 blah. But like people probably had a pretty keen eye when it came to certain like stamps that were on those papers.
Oh,
were,
yeah,
like,
true.
Are these official? Are these not? And they probably even had like a comparison to look between the documents. So really, this is just to say, I bet you that there had to have been some system of papers to where forging those documents, especially in a pinch for somebody like Lafayette, who is like, oh, shoot,
I gotta leave now.
I went from being legitimate to being a fugitive overnight.
It's crazy because he was literally called the hero of both worlds because he was the hero of the French Revolution and of the American Revolution. Right. But the mob just got so crazy, he was like, I'm out. Like,
right. But again, like that's one of those where, again, for anybody that's thinking like, oh, why couldn't you just forge something like that really quick? I bet it was way tougher than you would imagine it would be. And for a guy like
a lot
that,
of checks and balances,
right, who is very legitimate, he probably wasn't like, oh, I've got my forged papers on hand where I can just flee anytime that I want to. So, and I bet you there's also a sense of honor to it as well, that it was like only despicable people do that kind of stuff. And I have a sense of honor, you know?
Yeah. So there's a part of him where he's like, I'm not technically doing anything illegal by leaving. I'm just not electing to get myself chopped up by a angry mob outside.
Right.
But he ended up going to prison. It wasn't in France. It was one of the other countries around him. And he stayed there for 5 years. Washington tried to get him out, but the country that imprisoned him didn't recognize America as a real country yet either. So they were like, Washington is also a rebel. So that's, that word is useless.
Which, very small little sidebar. We don't have to get into it, but I recently learned that as much as Americans love to celebrate the tradition that George Washington was our first president, he was not. We had something like 7 or 8 presidents prior to George Washington. He was just the first after the Constitution had been established.
Well, I mean, we kind of have that same thing with like Robespierre in the National Assembly. Like France wasn't totally on solid ground, but he was like the president of the assembly in France at the time. And he's worth a biography of his own. I don't dive into him too much because he at least at this point in the plot, he doesn't bump elbows much with Alex, but
Maximilien Robespierre?
Yes, that guy. He like starts off as a pretty conservative Frenchman, but then like after like dissolving the church, there's this time where they're like, well, you know, what do we use churches for? And there was like one church that was atheist, and then he came up with his own called like the Cult of the Supreme Being. He basically tried to like assassinate and kill a bunch of people that even smelled like an aristocrat.
Interesting.
And then became like the leader of his own cult. And then eventually people got sick of him and killed him. Well, we might bump into it as we get into the story more. But
cool.
On the other more legal side of things, those who weren't rioting in the streets were forming lines around the block at recruiting offices. Soldiering for the love of one's country was a pretty silly and novel idea during the time of the king, but these days, any red-blooded Frenchman wanted to show their support by joining the front lines. And by the end of 1792, France had expanded its borders in all directions. It invaded the Austrian Netherlands, liberating Brussels from its monarch, and had issued a, quote, edict of fraternity to the world. This meant that any country who wanted to become a republic could call for help and France would answer. This was ideal and pretty lovely, but that meant that France would need a hell of a lot of troops to fulfill that promise. One way that they met the demand was to assemble what they called free legions. France would have its career soldiers, but alongside them, there would be groups typically divided by nationality that would come together to fight and disband when they weren't needed, kind of like the Minutemen in America. There was a Belgian legion and a Germanic legion, but in September of that same year, a mulatto named Julian Raymond would propose a new one. The, quote, Free Legion of the Americans and of the South would be powered by the sheer will of freed black men ready to fight for liberty for all.
Cool.
The so-called Black Legion would be outfitted with a legendary commander, none other than Chevalier de Saint-Georges.
Oh, cool.
Right? The Black Knight. Despite being a nobleman who played music for Marie Antoinette, in an odd way, his neck was currently being saved from the guillotine on account of the terrible racism that plagued most of his life. Like, first time that racism is kind of working for this guy, right? He was one of the first to join the National Guard when things were just kicking off. And now that he's in his 40s, son George leapt at the opportunity to command a Black Legion, and he knew exactly who he wanted by his side: Alexandre Dumas. Just like in his early childhood when he went from slave to count, Alex would be catapulted to the top again, this time by his own good deeds. Story of his bravery in Austria circulated in Paris, so a bidding war began on who could have him. The legion that he had served bumped him up to sergeant, but the hussars wanted him so bad that they were willing to make him first lieutenant. It was an incredible offer, but Chevalier wouldn't pass up the opportunity, so he offered Alexander the position of lieutenant colonel, which meant that he was second in command to the Black Knight himself.
Wow.
Yeah. So he went from like private to lieutenant colonel in a couple of months, right?
That's insane.
This news must have been completely unbelievable to Alex. He was forced to give away every privilege his father offered him and expected to live the life of a lower officer. But in just a few years, he would work directly under his idol in the first Black Legion France had ever seen. He accepted the offer, but asked if he could have some time before he returned to work. In the snowy town of Villers-Cotterêts, Marie-Louise spent 2 years waiting for her fiancé to return, and when he did, he was more than she could have ever hoped for. Riding through the tall stone gates, Alex was decorated with the medals of a lieutenant colonel of a new free legion. Claude Labouré couldn't have been prouder as a father-in-law, posting flyers of the wedding across the city. The young man who bunked in his hotel was now a war hero. Total, we were just talking about this. What is it? The Story of a Thousand Faces?
Hero
returning to the farm.
Yep. That's really cool.
The two would walk down the aisle together on December 4th, but there wouldn't be a cross in sight. Now that the king was on trial, the church was not recognized by revolutionaries, so the two were wed in the eyes of the nation instead of the Lord. We get into all sorts of weird, fun, religious stuff that maybe we'll talk about in office hours. There's like all these weird pseudo religions that sort of pop up during the revolution because, you know, the church and the king are like, you know, man and wife. And if you just got rid of the man, you should probably also get rid of the wife. So their honeymoon would be short and sweet with no really time for vacation. But by the end of it, the two were expecting their first child together. This would be the last time in a long while that Alexander would have time to rest. Now that he was a lieutenant colonel, he had his hands full, especially since he just found out the entire battalion was completely untrained and unequipped. And that is where we'll pick up on the next episode of Alexandre Dumas.
Woo! Good one again, buddy. Good one again. It's crazy. I don't know. I think it's funny in American kind of folklore, right? My immediate thought with this whole him commanding this black regiment, right, is I think about that movie Glory with Matthew Broderick. Have you seen it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's about the Civil War, and it's about this regiment of ex-slaves, I'm 99% sure, who all get under this guy's command, and nobody wants to do it, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, where I'm going with this is, it's funny how Americans can do this thing to be like, look at how great we are. Look what we did. And it's like, yeah, rewind literally 60 years. The French were already doing that. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's just cool. And especially that it comes like in this weird way that it ties all the way back to that guy that wrote the Count of Monte Cristo. Yeah, his dad was in charge of that. Like,
yeah. That's
such
a weird
thing,
callback,
you know?
right? Because the fact that like, I've almost completely forgotten that Alexandre Dumas, the author, is anyway associated with the story at this point.
I know.
Because, like I said, his father has just a tale of his own. And he's just one of those people that, like, he just keeps doing a good job, and you just can't help but continue to make his life better and better and better. Now, him doing a good job, he'll eventually pay for later when people want him to do bad things.
Sure.
But for now, like, Chevalier knew him when he was a teenager. They fenced together. He saw this like gangly teen from Saint-Domingue become a gentleman. And then he heard in a newspaper, you know, he wasn't even there. Heard a newspaper. Oh my God, Alex Dumas, like the kid, Alex Dumas, he got 13 Austrians to drop their weapons by himself. Wow, that's incredible. I really got to get him in the Black Battalion or the Black Legion. Like, that's such a cool, I don't know, story progression.
Right.
And now we are getting to the part where, like, hopefully, and I've noticed the historical record gets a lot better for him because he's no longer a nobody. Like a private is the bottom. A
lieutenant colonel. Wasn't that what it was? Lieutenant colonel.
Yeah, lieutenant colonel is the top, but I was going to say corporal. Corporal is the second closest to the bottom. So there's like no really reason to write anything about him. He was just like one of the cannon fodder.
Right.
But now he's getting to this point where he is becoming a national legend, and it's going to be really cool.
That's cool, dude. I'm excited. I'm excited to see kind of how the story progresses. It's one of the reasons I like this show in general is that, doing people that maybe people don't know about, right? I like doing popular figures as well. My next subject that I've been working on is definitely a popular figure.
I'm really excited for that one.
But, I think both offer up really cool things where these people that we know nothing about, we learn something and a pocket of history and about a person that is amazing, but nobody ever talks about. And then even with more popular figures, it's like you probably didn't know them the way you thought you knew them.
Yeah.
So it's always illuminating, but it's always, I think maybe I might like these smaller figures better because I don't know. I think it scratches that part of my brain that just goes, there is so much cool stuff to learn. And
also, like, biography is my favorite way of learning history because you get to do the microcosm and macrocosm of it. Right. Like when you learn about World War II and you're like, the Japanese went to this island, and then the United States followed them here. You're not hearing about the soldiers on foot. You're not hearing about their daily lives. But when you do a biography, you need context, which means that you learn both.
Right.
Like, I know so much more about like French culture and French history through just learning Alexandre Dumas.
Right. Which is why I personally, and this is a weird segue to get into it or whatever, but it's one of my theories as to why Game of Thrones was so compelling and House of Dragons sucks. Is Game of Thrones was like, we are going to spend so much time with each one of these characters that you're actually genuinely going to love them. And then the surrounding political, everything that happens is going to frustrate you through the eyes of these people. And then House of the Dragon, it's like, it's all the sort of political story of everything that happens.
Versus that guy.
Right. Yeah. And it's like when certain people will die, you're like, I don't even care because I didn't get to know them. It doesn't matter. So therefore, the whole story ends up actually being very boring because you don't care about anybody. It's just sort of like a big blob of context, and you're like, it's not very fun. It's the same thing if you look just any movie, right? Why are movies interesting? The best ones anyways, it's because you're following a really good character. You know what I mean? It's like Forrest Gump. The reason we love Forrest Gump is it's just this normal guy, maybe a little dim, who's going through all these world events, these profound world events, and it's seen through the eyes of this other person, just a little person. You know what I mean? Yeah. And then we get all emotionally involved into it, and we love it. So I'm totally with you. It's one of the reasons why
it gives you different perspectives. It gives you the up close personal and the actual far out like general context.
Exactly. So hopefully everybody in the audience feels the same way, which is hopefully why you're listening to this podcast, is that you want to learn more about history, and it's way more fun when you're able to follow a character along the way and know that they were real, unlike Forrest Gump. All right. Well, we will wrap it up there, everybody. Thanks so much for listening. Again, if anybody has any questions, comments, or corrections, you can send us an email at thebiographerspodcast@gmail.com. If anybody feels like supporting the show, you can do so by going to our Patreon page, patreon.com/thebiographers. For anybody that wants to follow us on social media, we're going to be around on places like Instagram and YouTube and TikTok. And we've been saying this for months, but we got to get back into our videos. It's just, got to be honest.
It's time.
I look at the content creators that are out there and I just go like, how do you do this every day? It's so boring.
I know.
It's so tedious to have to do this.
So much work too. Like I think about that with my business too. Like making a knife is one thing, but recording every single step of me making a knife is like doing two jobs at the same time.
It is. It's exhausting. So I think that's one of the reasons why I always hesitate is I'm like, I do this, I research it, we write it, we record it, we edit it, we upload it. And then now we got to make content on top of it just to try to promote it. And it can just feel overwhelming sometimes, but got to get the voice out there. So yeah, again, you guys can follow us on those social media platforms. And we kind of mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast, but Akiva updates on website and classes and everything.
Oh, yeah. So I've got a bunch of new classes on the website. We were booked all the way out till October, so feel free to look at the website there. I've got dagger classes. I've got bushcraft classes. But basically anything from like dead beginner to I want to make like an actual pretty solid product. And I am also selling my knives at a discount right now. If you listen to the first episode, and I just mentioned it earlier today, my van is currently kaputs, and we are looking for a new ride, so I am doing a discount code. Instead of biographers for 10% off, you can use code VAN for 25% off any of the orders on metalworkbymiola.com.
Screaming deal. Take advantage, people. It's good stuff. All right, well, we will leave you, everybody there. It's been a long day.
Yeah, it's so hot in here. Like, I'm dying right now trying to finish this episode. I'm sweating bullets.
All right, we will leave everybody there, but do remember, like always, ignorance is not stupidity. It is the absence of knowledge, and I do hope you all learned something today.
See ya.
You've been listening to The Biographers. For more information, please visit thebiographerspodcast.com.